what we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Mark Russell.
Charles Figley.
And we're very pleased to be meeting with you today as in episode 9.
Yeah, it's a break from last week in terms of focusing on military discipline. And I'm still not quite sure about, you have to have a military that has discipline, et cetera, but wanting it and getting it it's very complicated and challenging, it seems like.
Yeah, and certainly some of the, like last week, we talked about some of the ingenious ways that the military has gone about trying to punish those who are, exhibiting signs of a war stress injury. I'm thinking of the World War II experience that we talked about and the caging of these Marines.
Yes.
Out of the Pacific theater.
Yeah, so it was only Marines. That makes it's like,
well,
hey,
I think it was
animals.
I'll change that. I think it was both Marines and Army, because the Army also participated in the island hopping too. So,
but just from the Pacific, right?
Yes.
Yeah, around 1944. Because again, that brings me back to the fact that I never heard of this.
Yeah.
It's terrible and horrible. I would think perhaps maybe during the Spanish-American War or something like that, but not after World War II, in which these men were essentially saved our ass over there, and then they're treated this way. It's kind of remarkable, but that's what we wanted to cover, right, in this show, is to highlight the things that we've found that are recorded and reported in the book.
Yeah.
It's a very thick book, very thick.
Pretty thick. And yeah, I mean, that is the untold story, if you would, military mental health care, and how the military has attempted to deal with its mental health dilemma. And how do we treat, our U.S. service personnel who exhibit, war stress injury of some sort, and at the same time have enough preserving the force in order to fight and win wars, which is the primary mission of the military, along with its secondary mission of force health protection. And that's the dilemma. What do they do? And and these, I know we harped on this last week, but just the idea of a cage that's 3 feet tall, that if people understand that you cannot sit, the average person cannot sit down or sit upright in a 3-foot cage. And that's what these Marines and soldiers, these veterans who fought on some of the most horrendous battles during the Second World War, this is what they experienced on that long ride home on the Liberty ships.
And this is one of the reasons why we call it dark side, because we're letting light in. We're letting as many people as possible, in many ways, know about this.
Yeah.
So they can be corrected and not make the same mistakes the next time.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole idea, is learning from history, right? Which is George Santana's famous, quote of, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And that's certainly been the history of military mental health care, is one of repeating the same mistakes.
Yes. Well, another thing that I hope that we can talk about is the physical cruelty, the cruelty of physical neglect, isolation, and abandonment. And we definitely did start talking about it last week, but it seems like it deserves, in terms of the cruelty aspect of it, in terms of neglect as well as isolation and abandonment. It just seems like it's a natural and normal thing for us to cover in terms of looking at the dark side.
Yeah, no question. And some examples that come to mind are, like, during the First World War, they would have specialty hospitals for neuropsychiatric injured combatants. And the treatment of choice would have been to keep people isolated socially, away from the physically wounded veterans, and these people were put into these wards that were identified as, NP or neuropsychiatric, and they had a lot of stigma obviously associated with that, but they would be very much neglected into these barracks. And you see similar kind of circumstances in the Second World War, and even in the current wars, in Afghanistan and Iraq. People would be admitted to a psychiatric wing or a psychiatric ward, and these are often very isolated parts of the hospital. Not a lot of VIP come through a psychiatric ward as they would do a surgical ward, for example, or a nursing ward. And so it's just very systemic in terms of the neglect that any combatant would have faced in any of the wars that we fought.
I'm wondering why this hasn't been written about. There haven't been movies about this. I mean, it's terrible in terms of the treatment of those who were fighting wars. I just don't get it.
Yeah, no, it has been. There have been a couple of movies that do kind of touch on it a little bit. And one is during the First World War, called, I think, Behind the Lines, with Jonathan Pryce, I believe it is, who plays a real life British psychiatrist, W.R. Rivers, who had a very compassionate view of what was then called shell shock or psychoneurosis and in the treatment, but also in that movie talks about the neglect. It depicts the neglect of these mentally wounded soldiers up in Craig Lockhart, but also an alternative treatment, which we'll talk about in a future episode, involving electric shock therapy, which was more like electric shock torture. And it very vividly depicts what that was like to undergo neuroshock treatments for their shell shock soldiers. And again, at that time, it was done so in the best interest, and the view was this was going to help people recover their capacity to speak or their capacity to move their body in the light of some hysterical paralysis or something. But the means to that end were very cruel, but yet sadly successful in many cases, and that these veterans who were mute and or were paralyzed, who underwent this shock therapy, this shock treatment, often did recover their capacity to speak or walk. But again, the means to the ends was rather torturous, to say the least.
Yeah, just in so many words, yes.
Yeah.
Another area that I marked is another sad story, explaining military's cruelty towards psychiatrically disabled veterans. I mean, we're basically talking about that now.
Yeah. Yeah. In this chapter, too, we're talking about the legal prosecution, incarceration, and execution of those, combatants with some type of war stress injury. And you talk about, the ultimate cruelty would be, killing those soldiers, those combatants, executing them. And for many cases, individuals with a diagnosed war stress injury like shell shock or psychoneurosis or battle fatigue or any of the other labels, but that individuals who often, because of their exposure to traumatic war stress, committed some violation of the UCMJ, the military justice system, or the rules of warfare, and then were punished in some cases with their life as a result of their inability to either fight, or they froze, or they flew, in terms of desertion or something to that effect, as a response to their stress.
Don't we talk about Slovic?
Yeah, Private Eddie Slovic.
Yes, page 228. I mean,
Yeah.
I have that down for us to talk about, but
Yeah.
he was pretty rare, right? I mean, there weren't that many who were
Well,
executed.
there wasn't that many, but as far as execution of individuals who engaged in some type of misconduct, stress behavior that we talked about last
Yes.
episode. in the First World War, the U.S. The Army executed 35 soldiers in the span of about 5 months that we were in Europe fighting in France. So 35 that were executed for either freezing in the moment of combat, like they did not leave the trenches when they were going across no man's land. You know, they trembled and they showed fear in the face of enemy, and or desertion, you know, which was the flight response from stress. So 35 U.S. service in the First World War, 3,000 British soldiers were convicted of some type of fight or freeze response in response to the First World War, and 300 of those were actually executed, many of which were diagnosed with shell shock at the time. I think World War II, I think I saw something like 102 executions or something to that effect. And then Private Slovic was the last to be executed, who had no doubt some type of a war stress injury. And we talk a little bit about that in this chapter. And if I might, let me pull that out, because it is the last known U.S. service person to be executed. And this was in 1945 when Slovic was executed. But this is what happened. First of all, he was a replacement during the Battle of the Bulge, right? When the most intense fighting in the Second World War, after we, do D-Day and we invaded France and Germany to remove Hitler from power. And let me see if I get this. So it was during the Battle of the Bulge, an intense extended artillery bombardment. And this is from Slovic himself, and he was describing what happened on that night, November 11, 1944. It says, they were shelling the town, and we were told to dig in for the night. The following morning, they were shelling us again. I was so scared, nerves and trembling, that at the time the other replacements moved out, I could not move. So again, cowardice would be one way to maybe describe that, as some would, charge him with. Certainly a freeze response. He couldn't move. And what he ended up doing was he went to a Canadian Army hospital, I believe, and did not go to report to his front lines. And then started working like a mess tent or something like that, or laundry or something like that for the Canadian military. And eventually was reunited with his unit and told his commanding officer that he did not want to go to the front lines. He could not handle it. And so if he was forced to go back to the front lines, he would desert. And so he deserted again. And that was the charge to which he went to a general court-martial for and was convicted and was executed by his own unit soldiers in a firing squad. And although, I think in our book, I do say that he was diagnosed with the psychoneurosis, or, a war stress injury at the time. I haven't been able to find the source of that, where he was actually diagnosed. In fact, the one piece of evidence I did uncover was that he was evaluated by an Army psychiatrist and was apparently found not to have a psychoneurosis or war stress injury, despite his Slovic's very telling description of how he reacted after that intense bombardment.
And this, what year was that determined?
Well, that was determined in 1944, as far as whether he had a psychoneurosis.
And then 45.
Yeah. And 45 is when he was, in January of 45 is when he was executed for desertion, cowardice.
Yes.
So in our book, we describe him as being the last known soldier, last known combatant to be executed who had been diagnosed with the war stress injury. And so I had to maybe retract that part. He certainly, in my opinion, qualifies for the diagnosis. I mean, you're a PTSD expert. You hear him talk about being so scared, nerves and trembling that at the time the replacements moved out, I couldn't move. I mean, what do you think? What do you think of that? Does that sound like somebody who
course.
might have developed some type of a stress response and yeah, seems so.
Well, do you recall my sending you this in this letter from he's a retired, I think he's a vet, but he
Yeah,
also has a PhD, Lieutenant Colonel, and he was looking up information about Slovak.
I do remember that. And that's why I started redoubling and trying to check where did I find that he was diagnosed? And I don't know if that was in the movie, because they made a movie of the execution of Private
Mhm.
Slovak. I think not Charlie Sheen. Who's the older dad Sheen?
Martin Sheen.
Martin Sheen. Yeah, he played Slovak.
Oh,
Yeah. And so I don't know if it was from that, I got that impression, but at any rate, I mean, when you read the descriptions from the court martial, including Slovak's own testimony, but it was, it seemed like it was at least a case for like what we would today call an acute stress disorder or acute stress, reaction at the very least.
sure.
And yet they supposedly found that he was psychologically well and had no type of a disorder or diagnosis, so that would mute his sentence. And again, he was sentenced because of his desertion to be executed for it.
Mhm. Well,
So
that'll
yeah,
be a mystery, hopefully, that we'll solve throughout the podcast, figure this out.
maybe so.
So let's turn to then chapter 4, legal prosecution, incarceration, and execution of mental illness. And let's focus on the terrible injustice experienced by our first quote in terms of chapter 4, if you recall that.
All right. So let's see.
It is, quote, sending a message by punishing someone suffering from PTSD or worse. So do you want to talk about that?
You're talking about the quote on the beginning of the chapter, right?
Yeah, beginning of the chapter.
Yeah. So this was having to do with the ethics of military justice. And the quote runs like this: as many of these soldiers witnessed horrible events, they saw friends die, they lost limbs and faces, they went without sleep or food for days at a time. They have dealt with the same demons as the accused, and yet they have resisted alcohol and drugs. The accused is asking you to hold them in a different standard. Send a message to the others who have suffered. Give them a reason to stay the course and resist the temptation. Don't let Sergeant K use PTSD as an excuse to violate the law and put others at risk. This time, he damaged a wall. Next time, who knows? The government asks for a dishonorable discharge and 3 years of confinement because justice demands as much. And I think we pulled that from this treatise on the UCMJ and how the military has, unfortunately engaged in an unethical revolving door when it comes to military justice. And again, similar to stigma, where we're weaponizing the criminal justice system in order to send a message to the masses that if you exhibit cowardice, if you freeze in combat, if you flee from combat, you desert, etc., that those are grounds for being punished. And then the other is the fight response of stress, which is the activation response, right? And the most common symptom for combat veterans is anger and irritability. And studies have shown something like 80% combat veterans with PTSD endorse this kind of impulsive aggressiveness, whereas it's like 29% in veterans who are not exposed to combat endorse this impulsive aggressiveness. So the fight, flight, and freeze response of stress can all be subject to behaviors that come under the scrutiny of the UCMJ, the criminal justice system. And that's the dilemma, right? That commanders are dealt with, is what do you do if you let it go and allow people to commit various violations of even of minor ones, that's going to lead to the lack of discipline, the lack of good order, and affects the readiness of those units. So commanders are often taught that you have to set examples people who are not conforming to, the goodwill and discipline of a unit, and obeying the UCMJ, and coming down pretty harshly on those who don't conform to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking, I think it was last time or the time before that, about the period of time that I went through boot camp and when you went through boot camp.
Yeah.
And it seemed like your generation of, let's say, Marines, and you went into the Navy after that, but that there was a certain level of readiness, a certain level of preparation that was there during the Gulf War and beyond, but wasn't with Vietnam. I mean, at least when I went through, because it was essentially, if the war was going on, it just started. So we didn't know what the hell we were doing and how to prepare for it effectively, at least. So things have probably changed quite a bit since that time.
When you say preparation, what do you mean by that?
Preparation in terms of going to war.
Right.
Right. So, for example, when I was there, the rotation was 12 months. It became 13 months, just months later.
Right.
So it was, I think, especially challenging and difficult for Vietnam combat veterans. But being there and being through it, I definitely would rather be in Vietnam than I would be in Iraq or Afghanistan. What a mess.
Yeah, I think I could see some folks who have gone to Afghanistan maybe or Iraq and think, well, I'd rather do this than be in a jungle of Vietnam too, or island hopping in the Pacific, or it really isn't a matter of context, but yeah, the lessons of war trauma is that the duration of exposure, the amount of exposure, right, is what really can lead to the level of psychiatric casualties that we found in the Second World War, the First World War, Vietnam, Korea. And so that's where there was a intent to limit the duration of these deployments. And I think that's what you're in reference to, what we have learned in preparation for Afghanistan and Iraq, is that we were going to limit the length of those deployments. And unfortunately, it didn't start out that way. People were deployed for a year, 18 months sometimes, until they started getting into more of I call it a normal rotation of 6 months, if you would, which is the kind of, I guess, the length that people came up with as being, it's less than a year, and that will cut down the psychiatric casualties by limiting the length of exposure. But
did it?
No.
I was hoping there was another answer, but I don't.
Well, yeah, it's hard to say how much it did, because certainly the rates have gone up, and there's a lot of different theories about why more veterans in this generation have come forward and been diagnosed with conditions like PTSD than maybe previous generations. But I don't know how much that is true versus we're maybe better at identifying it now, but that I can't imagine that in the Second World War there wasn't as many. In fact, we talked about this before, that the trend had started in the Second World War, that psychiatric casualties outnumbered the total number of those who were physically wounded or killed in action. So I don't know if this generation is any better or worse than other generations when it comes to that.
No, I think that's true.
Or is it a great equalizer?
Yeah. Oh, thank goodness, huh? Boy.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to focus on, it's on page 116 if you want to look it up, but what is the military commander? I think it's related to what you're just talking about. What is this military commander going to do? Quote, enlightened commander must consider whether misconduct is rooted in stress injury like PTSD. But many of them can't do that, especially if they've never seen combat, irrespective of their training. I mean, it takes some time to figure it out. And obviously, much of what we're talking about in the book has to do with those that were experiencing this within the military, obviously, and that's what we're trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah.
But they take that home, and they continue to suffer from these things, and that's part of the frustration. Is couldn't we have done something to prepare men and women for coming home, not just going overseas or going into combat, to be able to take the uniform off and all of the emotions and reactions coming with it, and be able to let go of that part of one's history. It's not possible for many men and women, even if they don't have PTSD.
Yeah, no question. And, at a minimum, what are we doing to try to mitigate that? And,
Right.
a lot of the stories in the media of veterans who maybe had come back and then were involved in some type of murder suicide. There was a rash of that in the Fort Campbell, I think it was, from Army Rangers there. And we've had, other stories too that meet, the national or state news headlines. And, it gives, it certainly, it highlights as a real issue there, what we're doing as far as transition and people who have been conditioned to survive and fight in an environment like combat. And then what are we doing to kind of help deprogram some of them from that, those behaviors that were necessary to survive. But now you come back home, like you said, and now, finding that they're taking their aggression out on their wives or their girlfriends or their husbands or, on their children or something to that effect. They just don't know. How do you turn that off? And any one of us, for that matter. Again, aggression, irritability being like the top issue for people who are exposed to these extreme stress environments, then that can lead to all kinds of problems in the military or after the military. And that's where the criminal justice system, unfortunately, gets involved.
Yeah, sleeping is a real problem as well, and really a high note. It's a sign that something is going on.
Yeah, most definitely.
It's out of the blue. Yeah.
So I just want to highlight something. There was
Good.
The Institutes of Medicine back in 2006 or 7, I forget which, did a comprehensive study of the effects of stress and, as far as our mental and physical health, right? And they reviewed every study done, and the focus was on veterans in particular, trying to understand why, some veterans go on and develop conditions like PTSD or have misconduct, stress behaviors, things of that sort. And this was their conclusion of the scientific evidence on the effect of stress. Go ahead. You were going to say
Now,
something.
is this limited to veterans, or is it also active duty?
It is active duty and veterans, absolutely.
Okay, all right, that's important to know.
Yeah, but in their study, they also go and non-veteran populations too, and trying to look at what do we know about the effects of stress on the human body and the human psyche, right?
Mhm.
And this was their conclusion after this extensive review. It says, in the brain, there is evidence of structural and functional changes resulting directly from chronic or severe stress. The changes are associated with alterations of the most profound functions of the brain, memory and decision-making. They are also associated with symptoms of fear and anxiety, and they might sensitize the brain to substance of abuse and increase the risk of substance use disorders. And you think of the UCMJ, and what are some of the legal prosecutions of combat veterans? They often involve substance use, whether it was back in Vietnam, right? Whether it's marijuana or heroin or take your drug of choice, or in this generation, whether it's opioids or marijuana, for example, alcohol use. But this whole idea that the brain functional and structural changes of the brain affecting decision making. Again, if impulsive aggression or anger is one of your primary symptoms coming out of combat, and you have an impaired decision making capacity in the brain, you're going to be more prone to impulsive acts. And that's what we see when we review the literature of legal prosecutions, is people being prosecuted for things like aggression, assault of various sorts, substance use, desertion, unauthorized absence, disobedience to lawful orders. There, you can go out down the list, right? And every one of those charges, you could find some case for that. This was these functional and structural changes of the brain that occurred when, particularly, you compare their pre-deployment behavior and how they conducted themselves before they deployed. And then you see this dramatic change. A commander, you would think, would be the first to say, look, this obviously the deployment changed you and had a real impact. And maybe we need to treat the underlying cause and not just set an example of punishing those. And that's really kind of the nut and bolt of this chapter, is how the military has struggled in order to maintain that goodwill and discipline, but also the humane treatment of those who deserve it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it is hard. It's very difficult. And I mean, I've been an academic for 50 years. I see young men and women on a regular basis, and they're, not fully developed, have impulse control, especially at Tulane University in New Orleans. It's a bit of a challenge, but yeah, I mean, the crossover overlap between those that were in the military and those that were not. Yes, obviously there are differences, but for the most part, they're very, very similar. I mean, obviously the stressful exposure is challenging and difficult, and that really separates the two populations. But yeah, it's been frustrating to see the war through an academic. I don't know how you've experienced it as an academic, but one thing to have, a no draft and it's an all volunteer army, but it's another to keep making the same mistakes. And that's why you are a godsend with regard to what your passion is to prevent that. How's that going, Mark?
Well, I should ask you. You're the partner in crime in this. Just I think that fortunately, with our being given this platform to talk about some of our findings and the things that are keeping us from really addressing the problems of war stress injury. I think this is progress, and so to speak. But yeah, it's been very frustrating, personally, to not see that things have changed as much as I had hoped, and I'm sure you had hoped too, over the years or decades that we've been writing and talking about these things. But still a sense of hope that it could.
Yeah, we still have hope that it could, but it is, I mean, I know that a fairly large percentage of things that we publish together, we've inserted things that hopefully people will say, yeah, that's right, we need to do something about this.
Yeah.
And we keep waiting.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's just frustrating, but luckily we have our viewers. They care about these things.
That's right. Hopefully that we'll get some people that can pick up the torch, and then, because we're just a few years away probably from the next major armed conflict that the United States will be involved in, and these whole lessons learned or unlearned about the psychiatric effects of war. Well, someone else is going to have to carry that battle forward, right?
Well, I think there are plenty out there.
Yep.
Let me focus talking about anger problems. Every cohort of veterans in all wars had anger problems. I certainly had them. I certainly did myself.
Yeah.
I, to a certain extent, may have still some anger problems. I have to ask Kat. No, I know what she would say. So what do you think about that? What's your recognition of this? What's your observation?
Yeah, well, I think that anger and, impulsivity, just feeling guilt, being depressed, we're going to talk about things like a moral injury, seeing things that happen to people, or participating in things that violate our ethics or morals. All these are ripe conditions for us to engage in behaviors that maybe are very uncharacteristic, but yet are illegal in some ways. And we talked about misconduct stress behavior a little bit last week. I just want to go back to that.
Good.
I think it's
Yes.
really important for this chapter on legal persecutions. And that the U.S. Army, the Department of the Army in 2006, in their Combat Operational Stress Control Manual, right? This is their program manual, their policies. They talk about combat operational stress reactions are on a continuum from adaptive stress reactions, what would be useful for that individual service person or the unit in dealing with combat related stress, to the end of the other end of the continuum, which is misconduct, what the Army calls misconduct stress behaviors. And they define these stress behaviors as examples such as mutilating enemy dead, not taking prisoners, looting, rape, brutality, killing animals, self-inflicted wounds, fragging, desertion, torture, intentionally killing non-combatants. All those behaviors that everyone would probably agree that most of these would be illegal, unethical, and even immoral, and deserving to be punished. But this is what the Army says, quote unquote, that good and heroic under extreme stress may engage in these kinds of misconduct. And, we talked about old sergeant syndrome a few episodes ago too. And these were people who were the first out of the foxholes and the last ones back in. Yet over time, the cumulative effects of exposure to war stress caused them to break down, engage in some type of misconduct stress behavior, for example, freezing or fleeing from the enemy. So if the Army has a label for it, misconduct stress behaviors, there's a recognition that exposure in these types of environments that we put these young men and women in is a particularly potential toxic environment. And that's what the Institutes of Medicine showed in their study that said, yeah, you put human beings in these types of high stress, inescapable environments, you're going to get functional and structural changes in the brain, including areas important for decision making, for example, right? So yeah, with aggression, and you have a decreased ability to reason yourself, to solve your problems in a rational way, you're going to be more prone to impulsive acting out. And those are the types of troubles that people find themselves in. And now, instead of treatment, they're facing punishment for their infractions of the UCMJ or civil law. Which, again, we're not saying that people shouldn't be held accountable. If you murder somebody, either in a combat zone or at home, regardless of your, whether you have PTSD or not, you should still be held accountable for that action. But it's also looking at what are some mitigating factors. I think that's eventually later on, maybe next episode, we'll talk more about like the veteran treatment courts and what are some lessons from that have been drawn upon these kind of issues around misconduct, stress, and war trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. And that's really what this chapter is all about.
Yeah.
I want to, it's how are we doing in terms of time?
Yeah, we kind of start off, and I think we're getting close to probably wrapping this episode up.
Okay, great. And then we'll continue here the next time.
Okay.
Right. Okay.
And our listeners, thank you for listening. Hopefully we'll have a little more to say about the issue of legal prosecutions and the legal justice system as a means for the military to deal with its war stress injuries in episode 10. So hopefully you join us for that. Okay.
Later.
See you, bud. Bye-bye.